High above the vast emerald sprawl of the African jungle, where civilization was nothing more than a whisper against the deafening chorus of the wild, death came calling. Not with the subtlety of poison in a teacup, or the stealth of a dagger in the dark, but with a shuddering groan of metal and a freefall into oblivion. And Miss Agatha Marple, who had seen many a mystery unfold, was about to find herself at the center of one unlike any other. Miss Marple did not care for air travel. Trains were civilized. A train allowed one to sit comfortably, to observe, to listen. A train did not defy the laws of nature by hurling itself into the sky with an alarming confidence, nor did it require one to place their life entirely in the hands of a man seated behind an incomprehensible array of levers, dials and switches. No. A train was sensible. And yet, here she was, high above the untamed wilderness, encased in a silver contraption that trembled with unsettling frequency. The passenger cabin was lavish, but no amount of opulence could disguise the underlying tension. The air was thick with mingling scents, cigar smoke, expensive cologne, and unmistakably, the acrid tang of nervous perspiration. Conversations were hushed, measured, each word carefully chosen, each glance weighted with unspoken thoughts. The occasional clink of ice in crystal glasses, and the soft rustle of silk against polished leather, punctuated the air, masking an unease that was beginning to settle like an invisible fog. Miss Marple, hands folded neatly over her well-worn travel case, took it all in. To the untrained eye, she was simply a harmless elderly woman, absent-mindedly taking in the scenery. But beneath that quiet exterior, her mind was worrying, absorbing the details, cataloguing the unspoken tensions between her fellow passengers. Across from her sat Sir Reginald Dunthorpe, a reclusive millionaire whose sharp hawkish gaze flickered repeatedly toward the battered brown valise tucked beneath his seat. He tried to appear disinterested in it, but the way his gloved fingers drummed absently against his glass betrayed him. There was something in that case, something he was not eager to part with. To his right, Dr. Perel Stratton, an academic of some renown, was embroiled in a debate with the rugged-looking man beside him, a traveler who carried himself with the quiet alertness of one accustomed to danger. Roland Vassar, Miss Marple recalled, a man who gave little away, except for the fact that he trusted no one. "I assure you, my dear fellow," Stratton was insisting, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard. The excavation at Thebes was entirely above board, a scholarly pursuit, nothing more. Vassar's response was measured, almost too calm. "That depends, Doctor, on whether the dead agreed to be disturbed." Miss Marple allowed herself a small approving smile. A man with an interesting perspective. Further along, a woman sat with quiet composure, her fingers idly turning the pages of a dog-eared medical journal. Nurse Evelyn Whittaker. She exuded competence, the kind of woman who put others before herself, a trait that would soon be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. Yes, an interesting collection of passengers indeed, some engrossed in their own affairs, others watching each other just a little too close, and all of them utterly unaware that their journey was about to take a most unfortunate turn. It began with a shudder, not the usual turbulence, no. Miss Marple had endured those before. This was something deeper, more visceral, a tremor that rippled through the aircraft, setting glasses rattling and sending half a dozen hands instinctively clutching for the arms of their seats. Then the lights flickered. Then came the lurch. A woman gasped. The steward stumbled forward, catching himself against a polished brass rail. A low, ominous groan of metal filled the air, deep and unholy. And then the calm sophistication of the cabin erupted into chaos. The engines coughed, stuttered, died. The aircraft pitched. A sharp primal scream cut through the din as the floor tilted savagely. Overhead compartments burst open, sending luggage crashing down. A tray of fine china shattered, the shards glinting eerily in the dim light. Somewhere, a woman prayed. Miss Marple gripped the armrest with surprising strength. Her knuckles white. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, garbled with static and fear, then dreadfully clear. "Prepare for impact. No time to think, no time to react. Only a rush of panicked faces. Sir Reginald's mouth moving in a silent curse, Dr. Stratton clutching at the seat in front of him. Miss Whittaker shielding her head as debris rained down, then impact, and then darkness. A distant incessant buzzing pulled Miss Marple from unconsciousness. For a moment, she thought it was the drone of an insect. Then she realized it was inside her own head. A ringing, a persistent echo of the crash. She was alive. That in itself was a surprise. Slowly, carefully she moved. Her limbs ached, her head throbbed, but she was intact. The same could not be said for the aircraft. The fuselage had split in two, its once polished interior, now a twisted wreck, half buried in dense undergrowth. Smoke curled into the thick jungle air, illuminated by the eerie glow of scattered lanterns. Somewhere in the distance, something howled, not human. A groan from nearby. Someone else was alive. Miss Marple forced herself upright, brushing debris from her skirt. Around her, figures began to stir, some moving, some ominously still. Survival was only the first challenge. Now trapped in the depths of the jungle, cut off from civilization and surrounded by passengers who, she suspected, had secrets far more dangerous than the wilderness itself. Miss Marple realized one thing with certainty: the real mystery was just beginning. High above the vast emerald sprawl of the African jungle, where the relentless heartbeat of the wild drowned out the whispers of civilization, death had come. Not in the expected fashion, not with the slow inevitability of age or the cruel precision of a well-aimed bullet. No, death had arrived with the groan of metal, shriek of tearing fuselage, and the violent embrace of the unforgiving earth. And now, amidst the smoldering wreckage and the stunned gasps of the living, one undeniable truth hung in the heavy jungle air. Not everyone who had survived the crash had survived the night. Miss Marple stirred, wincing, as she extricated herself from the debris. Her head throbbed, a dull ache settling at the base of her skull, but she ignored it. This was no time for frailty. Around her, the remnants of the aircraft lay in ruin: twisted metal, splintered wood, suitcases flung open like gutted fish, their contents spilling into the damp undergrowth. Smoke coiled lazily into the thick jungle air, curling between the broken remains of first-class luxury, mingling with the sickly scent of burnt fuel and damp earth. The jungle itself was eerily silent, its usual cacophony of insect hums and distant bird calls muffled, as if nature itself had paused to bear witness. Miss Marple inhaled deeply, steadying herself. The air was thick with the scent of survival, but also something else. Something colder. Groans and murmurs rose around her, survivors dragging themselves from the wreckage. Figures stumbled into view. Dr. Percival Stratton, his academic composure shaken but intact, a trickle of blood darkening his temple. Miss Evelyn Whittaker, already on her knees beside an unconscious steward, fingers pressed to his wrist in quiet assessment. Sir Reginald Dunthorpe, predictably, was not tending to the wounded, but rather dusting off his suit with a look of distaste, as if the very concept of catastrophe was beneath him. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flickered over the haphazard gathering. Not everyone had been so fortunate. A body lay sprawled in the wreckage. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. The limbs were twisted at an unnatural angle. The torso slumped awkwardly over the wreckage. Shadows played tricks in the flickering lantern light. But Miss Marple did not need illumination to recognize the absolute stillness of death. She stepped forward, her well-worn shoes crunching against broken glass, and even before she knelt beside the body, she already knew this had not been an accident. There was something unsettling about the silence, not just the absence of movement from the dead man, but the way the jungle itself seemed to recoil. The usual hum of life, the distant calls of night creatures, the rhythmic drone of insects had been swallowed by something heavier, a presence, a secret. The murderer was still among them. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, pushing aside her own lingering unease. Air travel had been an ordeal, yes, but it seemed she would have to put her fears of flight aside. There was, after all, a far more pressing matter at hand. The survivors were gathering now, drawn by the magnetic pull of death, their wary expressions illuminated by the flickering glow of a salvaged lantern. "This is an outrage," Sir Reginald huffed, tugging his rumpled jacket into place as though sheer dignity alone could restore order. "We should have reached Casablanca by now." Dr. Stratton, dabbing absent-mindedly at the blood trickling down his temple, gave a humorless chuckle. "Sir, I regret to inform you that Casablanca is quite beyond our reach at present." Roland Vassar, the rugged traveler, let out a low, dry laugh as he rolled his shoulder, testing for injury. "Welcome to the jungle, gentlemen." The humor fell flat. Miss Whittaker, her hands steady as ever, murmured reassurances to the groaning steward beneath her care. "A competent woman," Miss Marple noted approvingly. "Even in the midst of disaster, some people maintained their sense of duty." That was a useful thing to remember. Miss Marple did what she did best, she observed. In moments of crisis, people revealed themselves. Dr. Stratton, for all his scholarly bluster, had a steady hand and a practical mind as he tended to the wounded. Vassar the adventurer moved through the wreckage with practiced ease, his sharp gaze flickering between the survivors, never lingering too long on any one person. Sir Reginald, meanwhile, fussed over his cufflinks, already calculating who might be blamed for this most dreadful inconvenience. And Miss Whittaker, the nurse, carried the quiet resolve of a woman who had seen death before, and had long since learned that grief must wait when duty calls. "Everyone accounted for?" she asked, her voice mild but firm. A murmur of assent, a moment of relief, then silence, a silence that stretched just a fraction too long, and in that silence the realization came. No, not everyone was accounted for. Vassar found him first. A few feet away, half hidden by the wreckage, a still figure lay unmoving. The body had come to rest at an unnatural angle, limbs twisted, head lolling to one side. A man who only moments ago had been alive, breathing the same air, sharing the same uncertain future as the rest of them. The millionaire, the academic, the adventurer, the nurse. One by one, they drew closer, gazes sharpening, breaths held. Miss Whittaker was the first to kneel, her fingers pressing lightly to the man's throat. A long pause. Then quietly, "He's gone." No one spoke. Miss Marple approached, her gaze sweeping over the scene with the practiced eye of a woman who had seen more than most assumed. The man had not died in the crash, of that she was certain. The body was too intact, the angle of his head, too precise. This was not fate, this was murder, and in the flickering firelight, surrounded by the vast and impenetrable jungle, Miss Marple realized one thing with absolute certainty: they were not alone. The killer had survived the wreckage, and now, in the heart of the untamed wild, where civilization was nothing but a fading dream, they were all at the mercy of a murderer, who had every reason to strike again. Deliberate. And then there was the curious matter of his cigarette case, lying just inches away, its silver surface unmarred, except for the faintest trace of what looked suspiciously like blood. No, he had not died in the crash at all. Miss Marple straightened, dusting off her hands. "Oh dear," she said not unkindly, "it appears we have a rather different problem altogether." Sir Reginald, blanched. "What the devil are you implying?" Madam Miss Marple clasped her hands primly. "Only that someone, dear Sir Reginald, has taken great pains to ensure that this unfortunate gentleman did not survive the night, and that I'm afraid suggests murder." The jungle seemed to exhale around them, the weight of the words settling like a tangible thing. A murderer among them. And so the game began. The jungle had settled into an uneasy hush, the kind that suggested watchful eyes peering from the undergrowth. Somewhere in the distance the trill of unseen insects punctuated the humid night, but closer to the wreckage, all was tense and subdued. A makeshift camp had been formed in the lee of the ruined fuselage, an arrangement of battered trunks and salvaged blankets, a dim lantern flickering weakly at the center. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, dancing over the exhausted faces of the survivors. Miss Apple sat slightly apart from the others, though she observed everything with quiet intensity. She was never one to fuss unnecessarily, but there was a great deal of fussing going on at present. Sir Reginald Dunor, for instance, had made his displeasure known at least 3 times. "Already I have been in many an uncomfortable situation," he declared, mopping his brow with an embroidered handkerchief. "But this, I must say, is intolerable." Dr. Peril Stratton, hunched over a torn leaf with a look of scholarly detachment, gave a small dry chuckle. I rather think intolerable would have been remaining on the plane. Sir Reginald, shot him, a withering glare, but relented, folding his arms in stiff-lipped irritation. Miss Marple, for her part, was more interested in who wasn't speaking. Roland Vaser, the adventurer, was sharpening a pocket knife in long, deliberate strokes, his expression unreadable. Miss Evelyn Whittaker, the nurse, had finished tending to the wounded steward, and now sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Gaze distant, she was watching them. Of course, the way Miss Whittaker's fingers tightened ever so slightly whenever the conversation turned to their next course of action, the way Dr. Stratton glanced toward the wreckage every few minutes, as if searching for something, the way Sir Reginald, for all his bluster, had carefully avoided looking at the body, lying several yards away, covered with a salvage linen sheet.
Yes, they were all playing their parts,
whether they realize it or not, and Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime listening to the confessions of small town and the whispered grievances of Sunday tears, recognized the same notes.
Here, fear escission.
Secrets pressing close to the surface, waiting to be revealed. Still, one must always start with practicalities. We must take stock, she said, her voice mild yet firm. The others turned to her, some startled, as if they had momentarily forgotten she was their vizier. Was the first to respond. Stock on what precisely? He asked, his voice laced with a me of little enough to count. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. On the contrary, Mr. Val, one always has something, even if only an understanding of what one lacks. It was the sort of statement that, had it come from anyone else, might have been dismissed outright, but something about the way she said it, so gently, so reasonably, made even the most reluctant pause. One by one they emptied their pockets, laid out what little had been salvaged from the wreckage. A modest collection of belongings emerged. A
Flask, unsurprisingly.
A pocket watch. Sir Reginald's notably checked more than once. A battered journal. Dr. Stratton filled with untidy notes. A pile of smelling salves. Miss Whittaker's neatly labelled in a nurse's precise script, and most curiously, an ivory cigarette holder. Unclaimed. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it for a moment longer than necessary. A peculiar item to survive such a crash, she murmured. No one claimed it. No one met her eyes. Interesting. With a small nod, she resumed her inventory. Rations were thin biscuits from a shattered tin, a handful of wrapped sweets from Miss Whittaker's coat pocket, a flask of brandy that Sir Reginald was reluctant to part with, a few blankets, 2 torches, and a single half-burned map retrieved from the pilot's belongings. A bleak sort of picnic, Dr. Stratton remarked. Dry Vera smirked. Not quite the luxury you're accustomed to, Sir. Reginald the millionaire sniffed. I fail to see the humor in our predicament on that, Miss Marple said gently. I do quite agree, for though the fire flickered in the clearing, and way bodies had settled into some semblance of rest, the air was thick with something unspoken. The dead man's presence loomed even in stillness, and Miss Marple, turning the cigarette holder idly in her fingers, knew that the first clue had already made itself known. The question was who had noticed the jungle stirred at dawn. A slow exhalation of mist and shadow. The wreckage, a twisted skeleton of metal and charred fabric, lay eerily still beneath the first golden slivers of morning. Light smoke no longer curled from its broken frame, yet the scent of oil and singed upholstery clung to the air, mingling with the damp, rich scent of the rainforest. The survivors, wary from a night of uneasy rest, had begun their search for anything of use. A cautious, methodical effort, though Miss Marple noted certain individuals were more selective in their findings than others. Sir Reginald Dorp, for instance, was not looking for supplies so much as for his missing valise, which he had spent much of the night lamenting. Dr. Stratton sifted through the wreckage with the distracted focus of a man cataloguing specimens rather than searching for practical necessities. Vaz moved like a man who had done this sort of thing before, unhurried, sharp-eyed, retrieving only what seemed particularly interesting. Miss Marple, meanwhile, preferred to watch. It was, after all, what she did best. It was Miss Whittaker, the quiet nurse, who made the first significant discovery. She had been kneeling beside a crumpled seat cushion, lifting a torn jacket from the wreckage, When her hand paused, a flicker of silver caught the early morning light. "Oh," she murmured, her brow furrowing, "this is rather fine." She lifted it gingerly, a cigarette case, elegant and gleaming, despite the dust that clung to its surface. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. It was a beautiful thing, undoubtedly expensive, crafted in fine silver. Its surface was adorned with a delicate Art Deco pattern, precise geometric etchings that spoke of wealth and taste. It was the inscription, just barely visible in the filigree, that intrigued her most. 2 Debt, never repaid, a message of unfinished business. Dr. Stratton leaned in with interest, adjusting his spectacles. Well, curious phrasing. Miss Whittaker turned the case over in her hands. "It looks untouched," she observed, "not a scratch on it." "Unlike its owner," murmured Vaser. Miss Marple looked up. The adventurer had not moved closer, but his gaze was fixed on the cigarette case, with quiet calculation. Sir Reginald sniffed, hardly surprising. "Silver polishes up well, you know." "Oh yes," Miss Marple said mildly, running a thoughtful thumb over the inscription. "Very forgiving silver. It retains only what it wishes to." She saw it then, the flicker of unease in Dr. Stratton's expression, the slight shifting of Sir Reginald's stance, the way Miss Whittaker, so quick to examine the case, hesitated in returning it to the pile of belongings. It was, she thought, a very telling reaction for such an ordinary object. She smiled, tucking the cigarette case neatly into her pocket. "Best keep this safe, I think." No one objected, but Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction the way their eyes followed it as she slipped it away. The first clue had presented itself, and now she merely had to wait for the second seal. 3. A quiet reflection. The jungle was alive in a way that English gardens never were here. Life pulsed in the shadows, the distant chatter of unseen the whisper of leaves shifting beneath the weight of something just out of sight, even in the rare moments of stillness. The air was thick with movement, with something restless and waiting. Miss Marple sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, turning the cigarette case over in her hand. She was not a superstitious woman, nor one given to dramatics, but there was something about this object that unsettled her. Perhaps it was the inscription, so carefully worded, so deliberate. A debt, never repaid. What sort of debt? She wondered. A favor, a betrayal, something altered and never forgotten. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that the case should not have been all if it belonged to the dead man. Why had it not been found on his person? Why had it been tucked away in the wreckage, hidden among torn seat cushions, as though discarded, or more likely, deliberately placed? She had seen things like this before. Not precisely this, of course, but the principle of it. Way objects had a way of revealing truths. Their owners wished to conceal a person, might lie, but their belongings told the truth. And in this cigarette case, she was quite certain, had a great deal to say. The first piece of the puzzle had been placed. Now it was only a matter of time before the others followed. The jungle had shaken off the mist of dawn, revealing itself in all its lush, unforgiving intensity. The golden show of morning light cut through the dense canopy, dappling the WRECKAGE with an odd serenity that belied the horror of the previous night. Birds called shrilly in the distance, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and foliage. Miss Marple, seated with the poise of a woman accustomed to Sunday gatherings rather than stranded survival, surveyed the circle of weary, rumpled survivors. She had suggested ever so gently that they convene, not as an interrogation, of course. Heavens no, merely a sensible little meeting, to take stock, to understand their situation, to know one another better. It was, after all, only practical. And yet she noted there was something else beneath the surface of their agreement. A silent curiosity, a wary eagerness. Each one of them wanted to know about the others, because somewhere in this gang sat a murderer. "Well," she said pleasantly, folding her hands, "perhaps we might introduce ourselves properly. I do believe we are rather past formalities, aren't we?" A murmur of assent followed. Some shifted uneasily. Others appeared disinterested. Miss Mar's gaze flicked over them, catching the briefest glances, exchanged little betrayals of hidden concern. "Ah yes, The human mind was a wonderfully transparent thing. If one simply knew where to look. Sir Reginald Dunthorpe, impeccably dressed, despite their circumstance, exhaled through his nose as if resigning himself to the indignity of it all. Sir Reginald Dunor, he announced, investor, businessman, a all advisor to His Majesty's government. Occasional Sir Reginald, murmured Dr. Peril Stratton with a thin smile. The older man gave him a cool glance. One does not like to be tiresome about such things. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, modesty is a virtue, is it not? A slight twitch of Sir Regal's eyebrow suggested. He had never been accused of that particular quality before. Dr. Stratton, now taking his turn, adjusted his spectacles. Dr. Peril Stratton, Archaeology and Antiquities, formerly of the British Museum. Miss Merrill noted the Forley, with interest. Others did too. If the flicker of Roland Vass's gaze was any indication, Vaser, ever the picture of relaxed indifference, merely shrugged when his turn arrived. Roland Vaser, a man of many trades. Let's say I procure things. Miss Whittaker. The nurse glanced at him sharply. What sort of things? Vask's smile was slow, deliberate. Oh, whatever is needed. Medell. Miss Merrill observed the way his fingers idly brushed the handle of his pocket knife. Not threatening, simply reminding. And you, my dear, she prompted gently. Miss Whittaker straightened her spine. Aileen Whittaker, nursing sister. I've worked in Egypt, India and elsewhere. A woman used to hardship, then practical. A touch too tightly wound. Perhaps the last to speak was Andrew Mallister, the injured steward, who had spent most of the night unconscious. His voice was horror, but firm. Mallister, steward on this cursed flight. He gestured vaguely at the wreckage. Not much else to say, is there? Miss Merrill tilted her head slightly. I think there's always something to say. Mr. Mallister, the steward, hesitated, then added almost grudgingly, used to be in the Navy before this job. That is, there it was, the small addition, the unnecessary clarification that was always revealing, wasn't it? Miss Merrill smiled kindly. Well, that is all very illuminating, isn't it? And indeed it was, for within their carefully measured words, their clipped tones and guarded expressions lay the tangled threads of the story. Yet to unfold, a man of government with secrets, disgraced archaeologist, a smuggler who procured things, a nurse who had seen too much, a steward with something to hide, and of course one among them who had already killed. Miss Merrill folded her hands neatly in her lap, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for unease to settle in. Now, she said ever so gently, let us begin, shall we? The jungle, for all its vastness, had begun to feel strangely confined. The wreckage sat at the heart of their small encampment, a stark reminder of their predic. But Miss Merrill knew better than most that physical isolation was nothing compared to the suffocating weight of secrets, and this group, she suspected, had plenty. She took her time, moving unobtrusively among them, never prying, but always listening. People tended to talk after all, especially when they thought they weren't being questioned. She began with Sir Reginald Dorp, who had retreated to the shade of a broken wing of the aircraft, attempt to clean his spectacles with the sort of patience that suggested irritation, rather than care. A ghastly situation. Madam, he said, the moment she approached, as if he had been waiting for an audience. Simply ghastly, and no doubt we shall be subjected to further indignities before this is over. No, I do hope not, Miss Merrill replied cheerfully. The indignities would be quite unbearable. He gave her a sharp look, unsure whether she was in agreement or subtly mocking him. She had that effect on people. You must be anxious to return to England, she mused. You have interests there, I imagine. Sir Reginald sniffed. Business concerns. Yes, important ones. And frankly, I had rather assumed my affairs would be in order upon my return. If not, heads will roll. It was an odd choice of phrase under the circumstances. A man of means, then, she said lightly. He hesitated, then forced a thin smile. One does well enough, Miss Marple, but fortunes, as I'm sure you know, are not what they once were. Ah, so that was interesting. A man accustomed to wealth, but speaking as though it were a precarious thing. A man who perhaps had lost more than he cared to admit. She filed that away next. She found Dr. Pebble Stratton seated on a log, frowning at the half-burnt map retrieved from the wreckage. He did not look up as she approached. "Curious, isn't it?" he said before she had even spoken quite. She agreed, tilting her head to study him, rather than the map. "Ancient civilizations do leave us with so many mysteries." He glanced at her expression unreadable. "You are interested in history, Miss Merrill, now." "Not so much in history as in human nature," she said with a smile. "But I find the two tend to overlap rather a lot." Something about that seemed to unsettle him. "Did you know the deceased well?" she asked, watching his reaction closely. A brief pause, a flicker of something annoyance, wariness, then a carefully constructed shake of the head. "Not at all, a fellow passenger, nothing more." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And yet you seem rather intrigued by his possessions." Dr. Stratton exhaled sharply, setting the map aside. "Put Miss Merrill, the world of academia is not as gentile as people assume. Rivalries exist. Fortunes are made, or lost on discoveries. If I seem intrigued, it is because I recognize a pattern. When I see one, I have, let's say, encountered men like him before." A rather telling statement. That Miss Marple's next conversation was not so much an interrogation, as a confirmation of what she already suspected. Ron Vaser, the enigmatic adventurer, was exactly as evasive as one would expect. "Do you travel often?" she asked constantly. He replied, with the kind of grin that suggested he enjoyed being impossible to pin down. "And yet you seem remarkably unfazed by all this," she observed. He shrugged. "I've seen worse indeed. Much worse." He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. She found Miss Evelyn at the edge of camp, tending to the still unconscious steward. The nurse was efficient, methodical, but when she turned to Miss Marple, there was something tightly wound in her expression. "You knew him, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Ware's hand twitched, small but noticeable. "I treated him once," she admitted after a pause. "Years ago, a minor injury. I doubt he even remembered me." Miss Marr doubted that very much. By the time she finished, she had learned a great deal. None of them, it seemed, were entirely what they claimed to be, and most importantly, none of them had asked her why she was asking so many questions, because they were too busy worrying about their own answers. The sun was high when Miss Marple discovered the torn scrap of parchment tucked inside the deceased man's coat pocket. It was old, brittle at the edges, the ink faded, but still decipherable. A fragment of something larger, something deliberately hidden. A map, not a modern one, not something from the plane. This was older, much older, and marked with symbols that meant nothing to her. But would she suspect it mean a great deal to Dr. Stratton? Miss Marple turned it over, thoughtful. A man murdered, his belongings rifled through, and yet this piece of old paper had remained either overlooked or left deliberately. Another piece of the puzzle. She was about to tuck it away when she heard voices, low, insistent, just beyond the trees. She moved closer, silent as a cat through the undergrowth. "A debt is a debt," one voice muttered. "I told you I don't have it. That's not my concern. The others mustn't know." A sharp intake of breath. "This isn't about the past, is it? It's about a rustle, a shift in the air." Someone sensed they were being overheard. Miss Marple withdrew, just in time. She did not know yet who had spoken, only that they had spoken of a debt, and debts, as she well knew, had a way of turning deadly. She allowed herself a small smile. A cigarette case inscribed with a message of unpaid debts, a map hidden in a dead man's coat, a hushed conversation about something that mustn't be known. Oh yes, the story was beginning to tell itself, and Miss Marple, as always, was listening. The jungle was not silent. It breathed, sighed, and rustled in a language. All its own. Leaves whispered secrets to one another, as the wind passed through vines, curled and slithered down tree trunks like patient sentinels, and unseen creatures stirred in the undergrowth, their movements punctuated by occasional shrill cries that cut through the thick, humid air. Miss Marple moved carefully, her sensible walking shoes pressing into the soft earth. It was unladylike, perhaps for a woman of her standing, to go wandering into the jungle alone. But then Miss Marple had never been overly concerned with what was ladylike. She found that a certain degree of harmless eccentricity allowed one a great many liberties. She had told the others she was merely stretching her leg. It wasn't quite a lie, But she had learned long ago that answers were rarely found in crowded rooms or forced conversations. No, the truth tended to present itself in the quiet moments, in the places people forgot to guard. And here in the dappled half-light of the jungle she could sense something, an echo of the past, a lingering presence. She paused by a great tree, its roots sprawling outward in thick knotted tendrils. The bark was old and gnarled, but something had disturbed its ancient skin. A series of shallow carvings cut into the trunk, precise, yet weathered. Miss Marple frowned. The design was oddly familiar. She traced a glove finger lightly over the etchings, feeling their depth, a pattern symmetrical, geometric, not the crude markings of passing travelers, or the idle scratches of nature. No, this was deliberate. The memory tugged at the edges of her mind. She had seen something like this before. The cigarette case. She removed it from her pocket, tilting it to the light. The Art Deco embellishments, bold yet elegant, intricate yet purposeful, bore a striking resemblance to the markings on the tree. The symmetry was undeniable. How curious the jungle, it seemed, was keeping its own kind of record. Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. A cigarette case inscribed with a cryptic message about an unpaid debt, a murdered man, and now carvings in the middle of an uncharted jungle that bore the same artistic flourishes. No, it was all connected. She took a few careful steps back, adjusting her perspective. The carvings weren't isolated. They extended beyond this tree, partially hidden beneath moss and creeping ivy. Some of the symbols were obscured, but there was a flow to them, as though they had once been part of a larger continuous design. A map, perhaps a warning. Miss Marple was pondering this when a soft voice intruded on her thoughts. "You have noticed the old marks?" "Yes." She turned to find one of the local guides standing a few feet away, watching her with quiet curiosity. He was a wiry man with dark, intelligent eyes, his movement careful and deliberate. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Yes, I was just admiring the craftsmanship." The man studied her for a moment, before stepping forward, tracing one of the carvings with a fingertip. "Old signs, very old, this place. It was not always empty." Miss Marple tucked the cigarette case back into her pocket. "A settlement." The man hesitated. "A place of wealth, of betrayal." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Betrayal? You say, how fascinating. Do go on." He gave a small shrug, as though the story was common. "Knowledge, once a great treasure, was hidden here. A man was trusted to guard it, but men," he gave her a knowing look, "men have weak hearts. The guardian wished to keep the treasure for himself, and what happened?" The guide's expression was neutral. "He was found before he could escape, and so he was made to stay forever." Miss Marple let the weight of those words settle. The jungle had a way of absorbing things, secrets, mistakes, people. "And the treasure?" she asked mildly. He smiled, revealing even white teeth. "Ah, that is a different story." "Yes." Miss Marple tapped a finger against her chin. "Or perhaps not so different at all," for suddenly she saw the story unfolding. A man entrusted with something valuable, a betrayal, and a cigarette case, left behind as a marker, a message, a token of a debt, unpaid. The victim had not simply been a passenger on their ill-fated flight. He had been carrying a secret, and someone had made certain he would never deliver it. Miss Marple gave one last glance at the carved tree, then turned back toward camp. Her mind already setting the puzzle pieces into place. The jungle had spoken now. She simply had to listen. The jungle was full of mysteries. Some were ancient, etched into the bark of trees, whispered in the wind that rustled through the dense canopy. Others were more immediate, more troubling, lurking in the spaces between people's words, in the flickers of unease in their eyes. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime unraveling such mysteries, though she would never be so modest as to claim an extraordinary talent for it. She merely listened, really listened to the things people said, and more importantly to the things they tried not to say. And she listened to the jungle too. This was how she came upon the flower she was returning from the carved tree, when she saw it perched delicately on a fallen log near the wreckage, its violet petals striking against the dull greens and browns of the jungle floor. It was beautiful, exotic in the way that only rare things were, but it was also out of place. Miss Marple was no botanist, but she had lived long enough to recognize when something did not belong. This particular bloom, with its pale lavender hues deepening toward a fiery orange, at the center, was far too delicate for this humid, dense environment. She knelt carefully, taking in the details. The petals were waxy thick, suggesting they retain moisture, unlike the broader, more fragile flora around it. That alone was telling. It was the kind of flower that belonged to drier, more mountainous regions. Not here. Miss Morrel reached out and plucked it gently by the stem, admiring the local flora. Miss Marple. She turned to see Dr. Perel Stratton standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her with polite curiosity. Local, do you think? She asked mildly, twirling the stem between her fingers. He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the flower. Well, a rare specimen. I believe. She studied him over the rim of her spectacles. The rather unique find in a jungle where it does not naturally grow. Miss Stratton's smile was thin. The jungle was alive with secrets, not the kind found in whispered rumors of drawing rooms or the coded glances exchanged across a garden party. No, these were the kind of secrets that lurked beneath tangled vines and ancient trees, buried beneath the weight of time, and more recently the wreckage of a doomed flight. The survivors had settled into an uneasy rhythm, their small camp flickering with the dim, uncertain glow of fire. Shadows stretched long, distorting their weary faces, turning familiar expressions into something almost unrecognizable. But Miss Marple was not one to be fooled by flickering shadows. It was not the night she feared, it was the company. She sat at her makeshift table, fashioned from a salvaged crate, the worn wood bearing the marks of its previous, more civilized life. Before her, spread with the same meticulous care one might give to a perfectly arranged tea tray, lay the fragments of a mystery she had yet to untangle. A cigarette case, its Art Deco engravings gleaming faintly, a torn map, its ink faded, but its message clear, and nestled between them, a single pressed flower, deliberately placed, deliberately found. Coincidence? Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. Across the camp, the others were occupied in their own ways, but the tension in the air had not eased. Sir Reginald paced with growing agitation, muttering about the incompetence of rescue efforts. Then Miss Marple suspected his frustration had more to do with being stranded among those he deemed beneath him. Roland Vesey, the enigmatic adventurer, sat cross-legged near the fire, methodically sharpening a knife, his movements slow, deliberate. He had the air of a man who had survived worse than this, and yet, something about his ease made Miss Marple wonder. Evelyn Whittaker, the nurse, remained beside the still weakened steward, tending to his wounds with quiet efficiency, and Andrew McAllister, the steward himself, looked far less grateful than one might expect from a man being cared for. If anything, he seemed wary, his gaze flickering toward the jungle, as though he expected something, or someone to emerge. But it was the map that held Miss Marple's attention now. She had examined it before, of course, a torn fragment, brittle with age, the markings carefully drawn by a steady, practiced hand. But now, with the flower placed beside it, she saw something she had not seen before. The inked lines, faint but purposeful, wove their way through the jungle, tracing a path that led just beyond the crash site. And at the very bottom, small, almost insignificant, was an illustration of a flower. Not just any flower. This flower. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over its delicate petals, her mind racing. Someone had left this here. Someone had known it did not belong, yet had placed it at the wreckage deliberately. A message, perhaps, or a warning. A shuffling sound broke the silence. The others were watching her. It was always fascinating, she thought, how quickly a shift in atmosphere could be felt. A moment ago, the camp had been caught in the restless rhythm of survival. Now it was still, waiting. Sir Reginald cleared his throat, his voice as pompous as ever. Well, what have you found, Miss Marple? She smiled pleasantly. Oh, nothing much, merely an observation. Dr. Stratton leaned forward, his sharp academic mind unable to resist. And what, pray, are you observing? Miss Marple tapped the map gently. That something has been left for us. She paused, letting her words settle. A sign, a clue, perhaps even an invitation. Vassar, still idly running his knife over the whetstone, gave a slow, wolfish smile. An invitation to what, I wonder? Miss Marple met his gaze, then almost absently, she glanced once more at the flower. Oh, I imagine we shall find out soon enough. The jungle had begun speaking again. The crackling of the fire barely disturbed the thick, humid air. Beyond its reach, darkness loomed, velvet and impenetrable, concealing whatever unseen eyes lurked beyond sight. But Miss Marple was not afraid of the jungle. She had spent far too many years navigating a far more treacherous landscape, human nature. Now seated at her makeshift table, she arranged her findings before her, with the practiced precision of a woman setting out her best china for afternoon tea. Everything had its place, everything told a story. The cigarette case, its silver surface worn from years of use, engraved with an unfamiliar crest, a cryptic inscription inside, a debt unpaid. The map, its edges frayed, inked markings tracing an uncertain path through the wilderness. The carvings on the trees, ancient symbols etched into bark, curiously mirroring the designs on the cigarette case, and the flower, a delicate, seemingly harmless bloom, but nothing about it was harmless. Someone had left it behind, not as an accident, but as a deliberate choice, a breadcrumb in the dark. Miss Marple smoothed its petals, her thoughts knitting themselves together. Footsteps, soft, deliberate. She did not look up. She knew that walk, that smooth, measured approach. Roland Vassar, the adventurer, crouched beside her, his gaze flickering over her carefully laid out clues. Working on a theory, Miss Marple. His voice was smooth, edged with curiosity. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the position of the cigarette case, aligning it with the markings on the map. Oh, nothing so grand, she said mildly, merely making sense of things. Vassar's lips curled slightly. And do they make sense? A pause. Then finally, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of smiles. They are beginning to. Vassar studied her, his expression unreadable. Then with an almost imperceptible nod, he rose, slipping back into the flickering shadows of the firelight. Miss Marple watched him go, her fingers still resting on the flower. The jungle was speaking, and Miss Marple was listening. Strange, isn't it?
Oh, I find strange things quite ordinary, Doctor.
Miss Marple said cheerfully. It is the ordinary things that are most peculiar. She let the statement settle, watching him carefully.
He was a man used to speaking in facts, in measured logical statements, but now he simply nodded, offering
nothing more, which was interesting. She tucked the flower into the fuzz of her shawl, and continued toward the wreckage.
Back at the camp, the survivors were in various states of occupation. Sir Reginald was pacing irritably, muttering about the incompetence of rescue efforts. Vassar sat cross-legged near
the fire, sharpening a knife with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to survival. Evelyn Whittaker, the nurse, was tending to the still weak steward Andrew McAllister, who looked less grateful and more wary of the attention, and at the center of it all, spread across a makeshift table of broken luggage. E.g. was the map. Miss Merrill had already examined the fragment once before, but now with the flower nestled in her lap, she saw it differently. The markings, faded, brittle with age, were drawn, with the same precision as the carvings on the tree, a route winding and deliberate leading to a location just beyond their current crash site. And there near the bottom, a small illustration, a flower, not just any flower. This flower, Miss Marple's fingers brushed the petals. Someone had left this here, someone had known this flower did not belong, and yet had placed it near the wreckage, deliberately, as if to mark something, a message perhaps, or a warning. The camp had gone quiet. Miss Merrill realized the others were watching her, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere.
Sir Reginald cleared his throat. Well, what have you found, Miss Marple?
She smiled pleasantly.
Oh, nothing much, merely an observation. Dr. Stratton leaned in slightly. And what, pray, are you observing? That something has been left for us. She tapped the map. A sign, a clue perhaps, even an invitation. Vassar gave a slow, wolfish smile. An invitation to what, I wonder?
Miss Merrill met his gaze, then glanced once more at the flower.
Oh, I imagine we shall find out soon enough. The jungle was speaking again, and Miss Merrill was listening.
The jungle had settled into an uneasy quiet. The soft crackle of the campfire barely disturbed the thick humid air, while beyond its flickering light, the darkness loomed velvet, unimpenetrable, concealing whatever creatures lurked just beyond sight. But Miss Marple had no fear of the jungle. She had spent too many years unraveling the far more intricate and treacherous terrain of human nature. Now seated at a makeshift table of scavenged logs, she arranged her findings before her with the precision of a woman, setting a tea tray, the cigarette case gleaming silver, even in the dim light, its Art Deco engravings catching the glow of the fire. The fragmented map, aged and fragile, its ink faded, yet still legible enough to hint at a path leading to something someone had died for, and her notes jotted neatly in the margins of a salvage bit of paper, comparing the carvings on the trees to the designs on the case methodically. Miss Merrill placed them side by side, tilting her head as she considered their relationship. It was all quite fascinating. A cigarette case inscribed with a cryptic message about an unpaid debt, a torn map that spoke of a journey perhaps, and the jungle itself, whispering clues in the form of ancient carvings, their symbols curiously mirroring those on the cigarette case.
Coincidence, Miss Marple thought. Not. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the pressed remains of the peculiar flower she had found earlier. She smoothed its crumpled petals and placed it next to the map. A connection. The map had, after all, depicted a similar bloom, a symbol, a marker of some kind. Someone had ensured that flower was found near the crash site, a breadcrumb left behind. She pursed her lips and made a few careful notes, working on a theory. Miss Marple, the voice was smooth-edged with curiosity. Miss Marple did not look up. She knew that tone. Roland Vassar, the man had a way of appearing when things became interesting. Oh, nothing, so grand, she said mildly, adjusting the position of the cigarette case, merely making sense of things. He stepped closer, his gaze flicking across her impromptu tableau. And do they make sense? Miss Marple allowed a small knowing smile. They are beginning to. He crouched beside her, his presence unintrusive, but unmistakably intent. A cigarette case, a torn map, and a flower. He gestured lazily. Not the usual ingredients for a murder. But you see, Miss Marple said, tapping a finger against the cigarette case, these things do not belong together, and yet here they are. She saw the flicker of interest in his dark eyes. It suggests, she continued, that someone brought them together deliberately. Vassar leaned in slightly. Meaning, Miss Marple said pleasantly, that whatever our unfortunate victim was carrying, it was important enough to kill. For a slow smile curled at the corner of Vassar's mouth. Now that is interesting. Miss Merrill made a few more notes, her pen scratching lightly against the salvaged paper. She had drawn rough sketches of the carvings from the trees, comparing them to the cigarette case. There was a pattern emerging. She had first assumed the tree carvings were a relic of the past, some remnant of an old civilization, but now she saw it differently. The engravings, the case, even the layout of the map. They were modern interpretations of something ancient. Someone had replicated these symbols intentionally, and that meant whoever had left them knew what they meant. She sat back, considering a debt unpaid, a hidden trail, a flower marking, something lost. Miss Merrill looked up at the jungle beyond the firelight, at the trees that held their quiet secrets. Yes, she thought tomorrow she would find out exactly where this path led. Miss Merrill had always believed that history, much like crime, had a way of repeating itself. The actors might change the settings, the stakes, but the essential themes remain: greed, betrayal, the lengths to which men would go for power, for wealth, for revenge. Now, in the eerie stillness of the jungle, she found herself considering just how deeply the past entwined with the present. The cigarette case, the torn map, the curious carvings on the trees, all pointed to something far older than their current predicament, and Miss Marr had seen such patterns before. It was some years ago in St. Mary Me, when a charming but rather unscrupulous gentleman had arrived under the pretense of cataloguing local history, a Mr. Howard Finch, well-spoken,
keen-eyed, and altogether too interested in the private collections of certain well-to-do families at the time. No one had questioned his sudden fascination with old church records and estate ledgers, nor had they thought it particularly strange that was seen frequently in the company of a woman with expensive taste and a whispering manner. But Miss Marple had thought it strange, and when not a month later, an irreplaceable illuminated manuscript from the 14th century had vanished from a manor library, Mr. Finch had quite coincidentally taken his leave of the village. The woman too had disappeared, though she resurfaced some years later in Paris under an entirely different name. The manuscript had turned up much later, of course offered discreetly at an auction house, its origins carefully obscured, a tidy little operation, but one not outright theft, but something more insidious, an erasure of history repurposed for private gain. And now, here in the middle of the jungle, Miss Marple felt a familiar unease. Stirring the cigarette case, engraved with its cryptic message, was not merely a personal belonging, it was a token, a marker perhaps, even a payment. The carvings in the trees, too precise to be accidental, suggested knowledge, a trail left for those who understood its meaning, and the map, worn, torn, and yet unmistakably deliberate, was the final piece. This was no mere murder of opportunity. This was a story that had begun long before their ill-fated flight. Miss Marple's finger brushed absently over the cigarette case. An old debt, she murmured to herself. Had their victim been the devil or the collector? Had he been running from something or towards something? She thought of Sir Regal's carefully measured responses, of Dr. Stratton's over-eager interest in the map, of Vaz's too casual detachment, artifacts, history, the jungle, and most intriguingly, a murder committed not out of passion, but out of calculation. Miss Marple allowed herself a small satisfied smile. Yes, history was repeating itself once again, and as always, it would be her task to ensure that the past this time did not stay buried. The jungle had begun to whisper again. Miss Marple sat at the makeshift table, her fingertips lightly resting on the cigarette case. Face the small elegant object gleamed in the fur light, its surface cool against her skin. She had always believed that objects told stories, if one only cared to listen. She listened. Now she had been staring at the engravings for some time, her mind idly tracing their geometric precision, when the realization came, not as a thunderbolt, but as a quiet certainty, the way a dreamstress might suddenly recognize a familiar stitch in an unfamiliar pattern. Her breath caught ever so slightly the carvings on the jungle trees, the designs on the cigarette case, the map fragment. They weren't just similar, they were the same. She straightened her expression, composed, but inwardly she felt the familiar thrill of understanding someone had gone to great pains to leave behind a message, one that only those with the right knowledge would recognize, and their victim, it seems, had been among the initiated. She took the map and overlaid it with the cigarette case, tilting the case slightly so that the patterns aligned. The Art Deco embellishments weren't simply decorative, they followed the same winding course as the markings on the trees. The roots sketched faintly onto the map. This was no coincidence, it was a guide, a cipher, and most importantly it led somewhere. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Someone among them had recognized. This too, someone had been desperate to retrieve what the victim had carried. And when they could not obtain it through subtle means, well, they had ensured there would be no one left to challenge them. Her gaze flicked across the canvas. Sir Reginald Dunthorpe, pacing irritably by the fire, rubbing his temples as though the jungle's oppressive humidity were a personal affront, which is threatened, sitting stiffly on a log, his eyes darting too frequently to the cigarette case, Lorre leaning against a tree, outwardly relaxed but too aware, to watch for Evelyn Whittaker tending to the steward, though her hands were not as steady as they had been before. One of them had killed, to keep their secrets buried. Miss Mills smiled to herself, tucking the cigarette case neatly back into her pocket. She would not need to look for the truth much longer. It was about to reveal itself. Jungle napped around them like a velvet curtain, thick with the fume of unseen light. The fire burning low cast long shadows on the wreckage, and the weary faces of the survivors. A sense of expectation settled over the group, an unspoken understanding that something inevitable was about to unfold. Miss Marple, seated with her usual unassuming composure, smoothed a crease from her skirt. Her sharp pale eyes swept the gathered figures. There was Sir Reginald Thorpe, his posture stiff and aristocratic, despite the circumstances, fingers tapping impatiently against his knee. Dr. Peril Stratton, arms crossed, his academic detachment beginning to fray at the edges. The reclining against a log with deceptive ease, eyes alert beneath half-lowered lids. Evelyn Whittaker, hands folded too neatly in her lap, the perfect picture of quiet self-restraint, and Andrew Mallister. The steward gazed darting between others, as if expecting the jungle itself to swallow them whole. Miss Merrill cleared her throat. "I must thank you all for your patience, sir." Reginald let out an exasperated sigh. "Good heaven, woman, patience is in short supply. We've been stranded here for days. What exactly are we waiting for?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Why, the truth, of course. That silenced them." She continued, her tone light yet deliberate. "You see, when our unfortunate friend," she gestured delicately toward the covered body, "was found, it was immediately clear to me that his death was not a mere accident of the crash." "And how precisely was that clear?" Miss Merrill looked at him kindly. "Oh, my dear doctor, I have lived long enough to know the difference between misfortune and malice, and this most assuredly was the latter." She leaned forward, hands resting on her knees, her voice taking on a gentle storytelling cadence. "First there was the cigarette case, a rather fine one, I might add, engraved with a cryptic message, a debt never repaid, an odd sentiment, don't you think? Not one of sentimentality, but of unfinished business." Her eyes flicked to Sir Reginald. He shifted uncomfortably. "Then of course there were the carvings on the trees, a pattern I recognized, though I could not at this place. Why, but when I examined the cigarette case more closely, I realized the engravings were nearly identical." Bass's lips curved into a slow knowing smile. "A secret language, then indeed," Miss Marr agreed. "A cipher, a guide, a message passed between those who understood its meaning." She let that settle before moving on. "Next we found a fragment of a map, worn, torn, but still clear enough to indicate a destination, and most curiously of all, the exotic flower, lying quite out of place, near the wreckage." She tapped her fingers together. "And that, I believe, was our murderer's first mistake." The camp fire crackled. The silence stretched taut. "You see, Miss Merrill," continued, "a murder is rarely a matter of impulse. No matter how it may seem, it requires planning, forethought. And our murderer, oh yes, they planned this quite carefully. Indeed." She cast a glance around the group, observing the minute shifts in posture, the twitch of an eyelid, the subtle tightening of a jaw. "It is clear that our deceased friend was involved in something rather delicate, a matter of great historical and financial significance, and given the nature of the clues left behind, the carvings, the map, the flowers, one must consider the possibility of an illicit enterprise." Stratton's voice was sharp. "You mean smuggling?" Miss Merrill inclined her head. "Quite so, Doctor, smuggling of artifacts, to be precise, ancient relics of great value, and where there is such value, there is greed, and where there is greed, well, there is always danger." She turned to Sir Reginald. "Now, Sir Reginald, you have spoken at great length about your business affairs, yet you never quite specified what those affairs entail. Investing, you said, but investing in what precisely?" Sir Reginald's face darkened. "You dare suggest—" "Oh, I suggest nothing," Miss Merrill interrupted lightly. "I merely observe, and what I observed is that you were uncommonly interested in retrieving your lost valise, even more than securing a proper rescue, almost as if it contained something of great value. Sir Reginald stiffened. "This is preposterous." "Is it?" she murmured. "Or were you, perhaps, expecting a certain artifact to be in your possession by now?" The firelight danced across his face. His hands clenched into fists. Miss Merrill shifted her attention. "But you are not the only one with something to hide, are you, Dr. Stratton?" Dr. Stratton's mouth thinned. "I beg your pardon. I imagine it must have been quite the shock to find your rival dead before he could reach his destination." She mused. "I'm sure all academic circles can be so very competitive, especially when one's career has taken an unfortunate turn." A flash of anger crossed the doctor's face. "And then of course there is Mr. Vasu." Miss Marple continued, her voice almost teasing a man of many trades. "You said one must wonder. Have you ever procured things of the historical variety?" Vasu chuckled. "Now Miss Marple, surely you don't think me capable of such unpleasantness?" "Capable most certainly," she said pleasantly, "but responsible? No, I believe you deal in acquisitions, not in blood." She let the silence stretch once more before turning at last to Evelyn Whittaker. The nurse had gone pale. "And you, my dear?" Miss Marple's voice softened, but there was no less weight behind it. "You knew the victim, didn't you?" Evelyn swallowed. "I told you I treed him once." "Yes, but it was more than that." Miss Marple tilted her head, watching the younger woman carefully. "You knew his past, you knew his secrets, and most unfortunately for him, he knew yours." Evelyn's breath came quickly. Now Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "A debt, never repaid. That is what the cigarette case said. And debts, my dear, have a way of demanding just justice." The silence was absolute. Evelyn's lips parted, her hands trembling slightly. He was going to expose me." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and so you ensured that he never would." Evelyn let out a shuddering breath. "He ruined my life. I only did what was necessary." Miss Marple sighed. "Ah, my dear, that is what they all say." The jungle, ever watchful, seemed to close in around them. The truth had finally been unearthed, and just like that the murder was solved. The jungle held its breath. The fire flickered low, throwing shadows against the tense, unmoving figures gathered around it. The confrontation had been laid bare. The layers peeled away with the meticulous care of a woman shelling peas for an afternoon supper. Miss Merrill sat perfectly composed, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. Her sharp eyes, bright as ever, rested on Evelyn Whittaker. The young nurse had gone very still, her lips parted, as if on the cusp of denial. But no words came. The carefully composed facade she had worn since the crash, the quiet competence, the gentle authority, was crumbling under the weight of exposure. No one spoke. Sir Reginald's habitual bluster had abandoned him. Dr. Stratton's analytical detachment faltered. Even Roland Basser, ever the amused observer, watched in silence, his eyes keen and assessing. At last, Evelyn exhaled sharply. "You don't understand," she murmured. I had no choice." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Oh, but my dear one always has a choice." Evelyn's breath came unevenly. "He was going to ruin me." Miss Marple nodded, as if she had expected, did nothing less. "Yes, I believe he was." Evelyn's fingers clenched into fists, her voice rising with a quiet desperation. "Isn't a good man. He made it his business to destroy people. He had information on me, on all of us. I expect." She shot a wild glance at the others. "He was a parasite. He deserved it." A murmur rippled through the group, fear, suspicion, a horrified sort of understanding. Dr. Stratton cleared throat. "You mean to say, he blackmailed you?" Evelyn let out a sharp laugh. "Blackmail? No, he collected people's pasts. He stored them away, kept them in his pocket like spare change, waiting for the right moment to use, and when he did it, was always too late." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And what was it exactly that he had on you?" Evelyn swallowed. The hands which had always been so steady trembled now. "A mistake," she whispered. "A moment of weakness. I was young, foolish. She stopped herself, took a deep breath. "It was years ago. A patient in my care. He should have lived, but he didn't. And there were questions, people who suspected." He let out a bitter laugh. "He knew. He always knew." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "And so you killed him, before he could expose you?" Evelyn flinched as though struck. "No, No, it wasn't she. Stopped, her voice faltering. Then softer. Yes, silence. The jungle pressed in closer, thick with the weight of her confession. Vaser exhaled, shaking his head. Sir Reg's lips curled in distaste. Well, I can't say I condone it, but I rather see her. Point. Vaser Stratton's face was ashen. You murdered him to protect yourself. Evelyn let out a shuddering breath. I didn't plan to. I only meant to confront him, to reason with him. But he smirked as if it were all a game to him, as if he already knew I had nowhere left to run. She swallowed hard, her gaze distant. I picked up something, a rock. I don't even remember thinking about it one moment. He was talking the next. Her voice broke. He was so quiet afterward. Miss Marple observed her for a long moment. Then with the utmost gentleness she said, I imagine it was a sharp intake of breath. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, her whole body trembling. I'm sorry, Miss Marple. Let out a quiet sigh. Yes, my dear. I do believe you are. No one moved. And then finally Sir Reginald let out a harumph. Well, that was rather unpleasant. Vaser gave him a long look. The man is dead. Reginald, sir. Reginald waved a hand. Yes, yes, tragic business. But I rather think we have more pressing concerns such as survival. Miss Marple rose, dusting off her skirt. But you see, Sir Reginald, survival and justice are not mutually exclusive. She turned to Evelyn. I suspect you will find that both are now out of your hands. Evelyn did not resist when Vaser stepped forward, his expression grim, but not unkind. She simply nodded, her face hollow with exhaustion. The fire crackled on the jungle, listened, and just like that the mystery was at an end. The night was deep and watchful, the jungle holding it, silence as if in deference to the weight of revelation. The fire, now reduced to embers, cast faint flickers of gold against weary faces, the flickering glow emphasizing the lines of exhaustion and relief alike. Even in whiter sat apart from the others, her shoulders drawn inward, hands loosely clasped in her lap. The confession had emptied her, leaving her pale and still. No one spoke to her, yet no one moved far from her, either. A peculiar limbo existed between condemnation and pity. Miss Marple, ever practical, took stock of the group. The tension of suspicion had lifted, but in its place lay an unease of a different kind, the sort that lingers after truths are unearthed. Sir Reginald Dermot, never one for excessive introspection, was already restoring his sense of self-importance, straightening his cuffs, as if this minor unpleasantness had merely delayed his grand return to civilization. Dr. Peral Strat looked rather as though he wished for a brandy and a darkened study in which to process the evening's events. Roland Vaser, always composed, had shifted his focus to immediate concern, assessing their dwindling supplies with a practiced eye. Well, he said, breaking the silence, it seems we all live to see another day. Miss Marple, seated on a log, nodded briskly. And I should think we ought to ensure that we live to see a great many more. Vaser raised an eyebrow.
You have a plan, madame?
Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Oh yes, Mr. Vaser, a rather sensible one. I should think by morning the survivors had found themselves restored to something resembling order. Miss Marple, with the quiet efficiency of a woman accustomed to organizing church
bazaars and wartime rationing queues, oversaw the gathering of what could be salvaged.
Sir Reginald, predictably, had declared himself above such efforts. Really, my dear lady, there must be a more expedient solution than grubbing about in the dirt, like common laborers. Miss Marple, unearthed, had merely patted his arm.
I quite agree, Sir Reginald. I should think that expediting our rescue would be a most efficient way of returning
you to civilization, which was precisely what she intended to do. Using reflective fragments of the aircraft, a signal was fashioned in the clearing, an unmistakable sign for any searching parties. Meanwhile, Vaser and Dr. Stratton worked on constructing a more permanent fire signal, ensuring that smoke would be visible even beyond the thick canopy of trees. As they led, Miss Marple ensured the remaining evidence was safely gathered: the cigarette case, the map fragment.
The flower, all small, yet telling pieces of a puzzle that even now spoke of a larger web of intrigue.
Beyond this jungle, would the authorities connect Evelyn Whittaker to the greater mystery of the smuggling operation? Would the artifact she had sought to protect or claimed ever be found? That remained to be seen. But Miss Morale knew one thing with absolute certainty. Evelyn's actions, however desperate, had been guided by something older than greed, fear, and perhaps regret for the first time since the crash. Evelyn Whittaker looked up and met Miss Marple's eyes. There was no plea in them, nor defiance, only an exhausted acceptance. Miss Morrel, ever kind, nodded just once, but rescue would come, and with it the end of their ordeal. The first hint of dawn bled through the tangled branches of the jungle, painting the sky in muted streaks of gold and pink. The night's heavy dampness clung to the air, but the mood within the makeshift camp had shifted. There had been no more confessions, no further revelations. Evelyn Whittaker sat apart, her face drawn but composed, the weight of her own words settling upon her shoulders, like a burden she had carried for far too long. The others, weary but alert, waited. Then it came, the sound that had begun as a faint murmur beneath the jungle's natural symphony, a distant rumble, mechanical, persistent. At first it was dismissed as another trick of the jungle, the kind that had tormented their imaginations in the endless hours since the crash. But then unmistakably the crackle of a radio transmission carried through the trees. Sir Reginald was the first to his feet. Good heavens, at last! Dr. Stratton exhaled sharply, pushing his spectacles up the bridge of his nose with fingers that trembled slightly. We are saved. Roland Vasseur, ever the cynic, merely smirked. Rescued, at least saved. As another matter entirely, the reality of survival hit them all differently, some with relief, some with exhaustion, some, Miss Morrel suspected, with the quiet horror of knowing that the mysteries of the jungle would not remain hidden forever. The rescue team arrived in a flurry of motion, uniformed men, their crisp efficiency a stark contrast to the disheveled survivors. Questions were asked, orders given, the wreckage was assessed. The deceased accounted for. Evelyn was taken aside, her expression unreadable, though there was no struggle. She had already surrendered, perhaps not to the authorities, but to the weight of her own conscience. Miss Marple watched it all unfold with a small satisfied nod. Truth, after all, had a way of surfacing when one least expected it, as the survivors were ushered toward waiting transport. Miss Morrel lingered a moment longer. The jungle bathed in the gentle glow of morning was no less foreboding in daylight. It had borne witness to deception, desperation and death, and yet, standing in his heart, she could not help but feel that it had simply watched, indifferent to the schemes of men and the fragile morality of human nature. Truth, she mused, was a peculiar thing. It was not always noble, nor was it always just. It was merely inevitable that the case was closed, the mystery unraveled, and yet Miss Morrel knew there were always more puzzles waiting to be solved, more secrets lurking in the quiet spaces of the world. As she stepped forward, following the others to safety, she allowed herself a small knowing smile. For now at least the jungle could keep its whispers. The oppressive weight of the jungle had lifted, replaced by the reassuring presence of civilization. Walls, doors, telephones, the small, ordinary things that had once seemed trivial, now held a quiet sort of comfort. Miss Morrel sat primly in a modest police station in Casablanca, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The room with its high ceilings and wide ceiling fan had a certain colonial sterility, functional, without charm. Papers, shuffled, typewriters clacked, and the faint scent of ink and tobacco lingered in the air. Across from her sat Captain Ari Giglio, a man whose uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable. He had listened patiently to her account, nodding in all the right places, making neat notes in his ledger. Now he regarded her with an assessing gaze. A fascinating story. Mel Mop. He tapped his pen against the desk. A murder, an artifact smuggling ring, and a trail of symbols leading deep into the jungle. Miss Marple smiled, unperturbed. Life does have a way of being rather dramatic. Captain Giglio exhaled through his nose. And yet there is something unfinished about it. No, Miss Morrel set down her tea. I rather think the murderer has been accounted for. Yes, Giglio agreed. But the motive, the true motive. He leaned forward slightly. Murder is really as simple as it appears. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, indeed, that is precisely what makes it so very interesting. Giglio gestured to the file before him. This man, our unfortunate, the smuggler's secret. The victim was more than just a smuggler. That much was certain. Jiro slid the telegram across the desk with a measured, deliberate motion. "We have reason to believe he was connected to a much larger operation," he said. "A network spanning Africa and Europe." Miss Marple, ever composed, studied the paper with keen interest. The ink was fresh, the words precise, but it was a single name that caught her eye. Roland Vess. How very intriguing. Jiro was watching her reaction closely. A man of discipline, his expression rarely wavered, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his gaze. "Mademoiselle, do you believe this was merely a crime of passion? A desperate woman silencing a man who knew too much?" Miss Marple folded her hands, her fingers resting lightly atop the telegram. She tilted her head just so, a glint of amusement flickering in her eyes. "Oh, Captain, I have often found that passion and profit go hand in hand." Jiro's lips curved into a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "Precisely," he murmured, leaning back in his chair. "The question then is not just who killed him, but who he was working for, and whether in the end he was the hunter, or the hunted." Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea, allowing the words to settle in the air between them. Finally she murmured, "Yes, I rather think that is the real question, isn't it?" She set her cup down gently. The case was closed, the culprit had been named, the evidence neatly tied together, and yet, the mystery itself had not unraveled completely. Some threads still dangled, whispering of secrets yet undiscovered. St. Mary Mead. Weeks later, the English countryside was in full bloom. The rolling hills stretched endlessly, a stark contrast to the dense, suffocating jungle from which she had returned. The air was crisp with the scent of lavender and honeysuckle, a far cry from the humid, overgrown tangle of vines that had once enclosed her in its suffocating grip. Miss Marple sat at her wrought-iron table, the delicate porcelain of her teacup resting beside her. The neatly trimmed hedges and symmetrical flower beds of her garden stood in perfect order, so unlike the wild, untamed chaos of the jungle. And yet as she turned the pages of her leather-bound journal, the case lingered in her mind, an unfinished melody playing in the background of her thoughts. She had solved the murder, yes, the facts had been laid bare, the guilty unmasked. And yet, there was something about it all that remained unresolved, like a message half deciphered. She traced a fingertip along the edge of the cigarette case she had kept, a relic of the past mystery. The engraving, a debt unpaid, was more than a cryptic memento. It was a warning, a testament to betrayals long buried, to secrets that carried weight even through time. And then there were the jungle carvings. Not mere decoration, but a message, a language understood only by those who had spent their lives in the shadows of history. Who had he truly been? That smuggler with too many enemies and too many unanswered questions trailing behind him. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the fresh country air. Was this not true of all human nature? People, like objects, bore inscriptions of their own. Some were clear, etched into their mannerisms, their words, their deeds. Others were hidden beneath layers of civility and pretense, waiting for someone observant enough to uncover them. A sparrow flitted onto the edge of her table, its small head tilting in quick, darting movements. Miss Marple smiled softly. Life, she thought, was rather like the jungle, full of whispers, of signs left behind for those who cared to look. Some mysteries were grand, spanning centuries, hidden treasures, elaborate deceptions. Others were more modest, the missing brooch, the curious neighbor who watched too closely, the letter hidden away in a drawer for decades. But in the end, all mysteries, whether born of greed, jealousy, or fear, came down to the same thing: human nature. Dipping her pen in ink, she began to write, her looping script neat and precise. The late afternoon sun bathed the garden in golden light, casting long shadows over the roses. She paused, tapping the pen lightly against the page, before writing her final line. There will always be more puzzles to solve. A knowing smile played on her lips as she closed the journal. The jungle case had ended, the guilty had been exposed, the truth laid bare. And yet she knew, somewhere in the drawing room of an unsuspecting household, or hidden in the whispered gossip of a seaside town, another mystery was already beginning to take shape. For the world was full of secrets, layers waiting to be peeled away. whispers waiting to be heard. Miss Marple picked up her teacup, took a thoughtful sip, and let the soft breeze carry away the last of the jungle's whispers.